Welcome to Stump the Pastor. Today's question comes from Jennifer in Alabama. She says, "The Bible says to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. But what about unbelievers? Do they go straight to hell? And if so, can Satan use them, or are they bound in hell?" Now, just so you know, Jennifer is one of my wonderful nieces, and I have amazing nephews and nieces, and I appreciate her sending in a question for this week's Stump the Pastor. Now, the scenario that she asked about is the kind of question one often hears in a conservative Christian setting. Now, I grew up in such a setting, so this is not an unfamiliar kind of question. The dichotomy that is set up in this kind of question, though, is based on an assumption. And that assumption is that to be considered a Christian means that you're either trying to go to heaven or trying to avoid hell, or maybe both at the same time. And you have probably heard people in your own life who believe that the afterlife, what happens after we die, is the central feature upon how they understand God. The whole relationship of a Christian is to make sure that we go to heaven. That's why they go to church. That's how they understand life. Why they have an eye for what they do. Now, this is not my experience of my niece or her faith. So I am responding to her question as I think she wrote it, as a hypothetical Joe or Jane Christian on the street. Now, actually nobody knows what the term heaven and hell represent. Although probably most Christians think that they seem to have the corner on going to one and not the other. But if our experience of God is always metaphorical, remember, because human minds can't comprehend the reality of God. So if our experience of God is always metaphorical, then we can assume that our ideas around heaven and hell are also metaphorical. Now, for me personally, I long ago gave up needing to base my Christian faith on the afterlife because I trust God. So I don't have any concerns about what happens after I'm gone. If God is love and grace, then whatever happens after death is in God's sphere, and I trust it to be love and grace. My experience of much of conservative Christianity is that heaven and hell are used as carrot and stick to make people behave here. And quite honestly, I hold a very different view of what it means to be a Christian. My faith only has meaning if it applies to who I am now. You see, I can use my life to heal or destroy, to embody grace or create division, to care for the hungry, stranger, weak, and sick, or serve my own interests. And sometimes I do both at the same time. See, I'm still a work in progress too. The more we follow Jesus' example of what it means to live God's grace now, the less likely we are to need to threaten others or ourselves with damnation. I believe Jesus calls disciples in order to make our world a better place for all of God's people, not just Christians. Now, none of us is perfect in accomplishing this, so we learn from our mistakes. We give up old ideas when they prove not to be helpful. And we always need to stay aware of how privilege and experience color how every one of us sees the world and God. I can't tell you what heaven and hell are like because none of us knows. I can tell you that I trust God's grace, so I don't need to believe eternal damnation is part of God's plan. I trust God's grace, so I don't need a mansion over the hilltop, although the gospel song is really catchy. I trust God's grace, so I try to emulate that grace in as many ways as I know how. And part of that emulation for me means welcoming the stranger, helping the vulnerable, loving the different, caring for the wounded. And I don't do it perfectly. There's always more to learn. But in the end, let me encourage all of you to do this. Simply trust God. Love people. And let everything else go. See you next time. Stump the Pastor. Well, thanks for the question, Jennifer. It's always good to hear from you and any of my nieces and nephews. If you have a question you would like to offer me, the email address is on your screen. Send it to me and we'll get to it. See you next time on Stump the Pastor.